This is Winchester Academy.
Dr. ALFRED McCOY.
There we go.
Thank you, Maggie, for that very kind introduction. Is my volume okay? Okay. I'm going to be discussing for about 45 minutes. Whoops, that's not so great.
That isn't okay.
I'll try moving it down. I'll be discussing for about 45 minutes the legacy of the Vietnam War for the conduct of warfare in the 21st century. Now, much of what I'm going to be talking about today is drawn from my new book, In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power, which was published just last month. I'm going to address a single central question in this lecture this evening, just like I do all my talks, my lectures at the University of Wisconsin. Very simply, I'm going to be asking and trying to answer what was the legacy of the Vietnam War for the conduct of U.S. foreign policy and warfare in the decade since the fall of Saigon in 1975. Now, in general, I feel that the deep generational and political divisions that the Vietnam War generated have obscured its profound and lasting impact, particularly its covert operations and air warfare. And I refer to the impact on post-war U.S. foreign policy. Now, in ways that I think most Americans do not appreciate, mired as we are in the debate over Vietnam, good or bad, should have been fought, shouldn't have been fought, all of that, Vietnam was an extraordinary war fought across the full spectrum of combat capabilities, conventional, covert, land, air, sea, and space, that strained the U.S. national security apparatus to its breaking point, forcing in the midst of this crisis a fundamental transformation of the U.S. military. And though failing at the time, the Pentagon deployed the full force of America's most advanced technology in ways that created the first electronic battlefield and proved a seminal precursor for the development of a new form of robotic warfare that would take full form during the global war on terror. The war's legacy will become clearer if we examine its air operations, above all the secret war in Laos, both, as I said, air operations and the use of tribal militia. Now, as we'll see, both aspects of this war left a mingled legacy of military effectiveness and moral ambiguity. So we're going to do something a little bit different than most of the emphasis on the Vietnam War that you see, for example, in the Ken Burns documentary. He virtually doesn't mention Laos at all. So we're going to be going to this forgotten chapter of the Vietnam War. And in many ways, it's the biggest chapter and it's the most important chapter in terms of the legacy. Now, for over a decade, from 1964 to 1974, the United States fought a secret war in Laos with 30,000 CIA militia and massive U.S. Air Force bombing in a desperate effort to slow the infiltration of communist forces through Laos down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam. And let me explain the reason why. The entire logic of General Westmoreland's strategy in Vietnam, his formula for victory, three straight started victory, you move from defense to offense, you neutralize, and then you defeat the enemy. And how you accomplish this in this three-phase path to victory, which, by the way, didn't happen, just in case you thought maybe it did, attrition, okay? We kill more enemy on the battlefield. We destroy more material on the battlefield than the enemy can resupply down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, through the Mujia Pass, down through southern Laos, and then through the mountains into South Vietnam, okay? So bombing the enemy at that choke point in southern Laos became critical. And in order to maintain that bombing campaign, we had to make sure that the shaky neutralist government in Vientiane, the capital of Laos, didn't fall from power. Because once the communists took power, they could invoke a Geneva Accord of 1962, which neutralized Laos and prevented the bombing. So there were two key theaters, northern Laos, southern Laos, and they were, although seemingly remote and separate from the war in Vietnam, they were absolutely critical for any chance of U.S. victory in Vietnam. So, although it seems like a sideshow, in fact, it's central. Now, since this covert warfare was clandestine then, and its records are largely classified today, most Americans are still unaware of the massive U.S. bombing of Laos. In an oral history interview 6 years after the end of the Vietnam War in 1981, the former director of the CIA, Richard Helms, praised the Laos secret war, saying, and I quote, "This was a major operation for the agency. It took manpower. It took specially qualified manpower. It was dangerous. It was difficult. The CIA did a superb job." Not only did the U.S. air operations over Laos produce major innovations in warfare, but they did so in ways that could be considered, as I will argue tonight, a war crime. Between 1964 and 1973, the U.S. Air Force dropped an unimaginable 2,100,000 tons of bombs on tiny Laos, then rated by the United Nations as the poorest nation on the planet. This was a tonnage equal to the entire Allied tonnage of exactly the same figure, 2.1 million tons, that the United States dropped on both Germany and Japan in the whole of World War II. Drawing upon lessons learned in Laos, the U.S. Air Force also dropped over 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia, 3 times the conventional tonnage dropped on Japan from 1969 to 1973. By the time the fighting stopped in April 1973, tiny, impoverished Laos had become the most heavily bombed nation in the history of warfare, then or now unsurpassed. Now, though much of this tonnage was dropped on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the forests of southern Laos, some 500,000 tons, again 3 times the conventional tonnage dropped on Japan in World War II, decimated populated areas of northern Laos surrounding a highland plateau called the Plain of Jars. This massive bombardment made a wasteland of this narrow plain, with 50,000 peasants, bamboo villages, market towns, medieval Buddhist temples in an area about 40 miles wide. Imagine 500,000 tons of bombs pounding down upon an area 40 miles wide. The secret war also developed new means of delivering lethal firepower from the air alone against enemy ground forces through both AC-47 and AC-130 gunships, firing 6,000 rounds a minute, and fighter bombers dropping 500-pound bomb casings loaded with hundreds of lethal anti-personnel bombs that spread across the ground, still killing, even today, several hundred people a year in Laos. The massive U.S. bombing and its destruction of an ancient Lao Phung civilization would seem a clear violation of the 1949 Geneva Convention on the protection of civilians in a time of war. Let's turn now to the other area of U.S. bombardment in Laos, southern Laos. As the largest air war in military history, Indochina served as an ad hoc testing ground for the transformation of modern warfare. Plunged into history's longest and largest air war over Indochina, the U.S. Air Force developed all of the technological requisites to make air power a singular, standalone instrument of war, including satellite communication, unmanned aerial drones for intelligence, and history's first electronic battlefield with electronic sensors and computerized bombing. Now, under so-called Operation Igloo White, there are no igloos in Southeast Asia, it's a tropical region, but it's curious. Okay, Operation Igloo White, that's what they called it. I don't know where they got that. Anyway, the U.S. Air Force spent about $800 million a year, the better part of $1 billion a year, every year from 1967 to 1973, to lace that narrow strip of land, about 50, 60 miles wide and about 200 miles long, where the Mujia Pass came from North Vietnam into Laos, and to lace it with a network of 20,000 acoustic, seismic, thermal, and ammonia-sensitive sensors, okay? And these sensors were dropped from the aircraft. They were weighted to spiral downward, and they would thunk into the ground. And just like, you know, at Disneyland, when you touch the tree, but it looks just like a tree, but it's a fake tree. Well, they were all painted to look like natural vegetation, all right? So they suppose it couldn't be spotted. And these 20,000 sensors transmitted this torrent of electrosonic signals upward. And flying above this zone in southern Laos were 4 EC-121 communications aircraft, the ones you see with the great big sort of dishes on the top, the Cold War. And they were sucking up this electronic noise and transmitting it to what was then the largest building in Southeast Asia, a 20,000 square foot concrete structure at Nakhon Phanom Air Base just across the Mekong River inside Thailand, which had then, two amazingly large IBM computers with the first visual display units. Up to this time, the output of computers came through basically dot matrix printers. This was the first visual display unit that the data from all those signals through a special IBM program would be translated into a single line that the Air Force technicians that watched it dubbed the worm, that would scooge across the screen with a quadrant, a grid, which represented, if you will, the coordinates of where that line was in actual southern Laos. And once they got a critical mass of intelligence, either noise or heat or ammonia, what's ammonia for? Mammal urine, okay? Ammonia is in all mammal urine. So a density of all of those. Once that came together to indicate that there was a truck moving down that line, then the coordinates would be sent to F-4 Phantoms that would take off, and then they actually got sophisticated enough so that the computers would send a signal in the dark to the Phantom jets, and the Phantoms would just be flown by the pilots, but the bombs would be released by the computers. This was state-of-the-art warfare, pushing beyond anything that had ever gone before. Now, during this same period in which this operated, the U.S. Air Force dropped about 1,500,000 tons of bombs on Laos, about 10 times the conventional tonnage dropped on Japan during all of World War II. And through a hermetic data loop, worm seen on screen, coordinates bombed, worm disappears, the Air Force assumed that from October 1970 to May of 1971, for example, that 80% of the North Vietnamese trucks were destroyed. The Hanoi claimed they only lost 15%, and the CIA estimated that only 20% were lost. So the CIA and Hanoi had actually agreed that the Air Force was egregiously overestimating the effectiveness of this technology. And then in the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese sent 100,000 troops with tanks, trucks, and artillery right through the sensor field, absolutely undetected, all right, and launched the Winton Hue offensive on the cities of South Vietnam. And at that point, the Pacific Air Force Command concluded that the effort was a failure. Now, despite its immediate failure, the air war in Indochina was also responsibility for some technological successes obscured by the decades of secrecy. During the war, the Air Force also accelerated the development of unmanned aircraft by adapting the dumb Ryan Fire-B target drone. What there was basically an unguided rocket that they would fire from one ship to go past the guns on a Navy ship, and so the Navy ships could practice their anti-aircraft fire on this drone. The way it was done in World War II was the aircraft pulling the drone, and it's possible to mistake the aircraft for the drone. Anyway, so this was a way of eliminating that possibility. And these have been developed by the Ryan Corporation of California back in the 1950s. And what they did is they began experimenting with making these dumb drones smart. And by the end of the war, these drones had thrown 3,500 surveillance sorties over China, North Vietnam, and Laos. They'd actually been quite successful in one instance in which the drone actually helped intercept the launch codes for the Soviet missiles, the surface-to-air missiles over Hanoi, and then allowed jamming of launch codes. By the end of the air operations over Indochina in 1973, sophisticated drones were flying programmed via low-resolution television over 2,000 miles going far into southern China. In the same period, the Air Force achieved an historic first in a test in California with one of these Vietnam-era sort of semi-smart drones. They actually fired a missile from the drone, the first time that a missile was fired from a drone. That was 1971, okay? Now, though this program was slowed for 20 years after the Vietnam War, The Air Force wasn't interested, and the Navy didn't like them because they couldn't be landed safely on the deck of an aircraft carrier. This was the origin of the current U.S. drone operations worldwide. The air war in Vietnam was also the impetus for the development of the Pentagon's Global Telecommunications Satellite System, another important first that's critical for the architecture of post-Vietnam U.S. military power. Now, in 1962, some of you may remember, Bell Laboratories launched the successful Telstar satellite that dazzled the world with live images of sports, entertainment, and news during its 7-month low-altitude orbit. Meanwhile, in that same era, the Advanced Research Project Administration of the Defense Department, now called DARPA, had been working with contractors, General Electric and Hughes Aerospace, to develop larger military models of the satellites for higher geosynchronous thank you, orbits with wide coverage and longer life. After the initial DARPA satellite system was launched, 7 orbital satellites in 1966, ground terminals in Vietnam started transmitting high-resolution aerial surveillance photos to Washington. The Pentagon regarded this as a revolutionary development because this gave the Pentagon instantaneous photo intelligence from the field in the Pentagon, where that gave the Pentagon tremendous knowledge and control over operations in Vietnam. This was so successful that the Pentagon accelerated the launch of an additional 21 satellites over the next 2 years, up to 1968, and the result was the United States became the first and only power on the planet that actually had a global telecommunications satellite system. It will not be until 2020 that China has 35 satellites, and they will have the second one. So from 1968 to 2020, the U.S. had control over what the Air Force calls the ultimate high ground. We had the only global telecommunications satellite system, which has been critical to U.S. power. Now virtually all sea, command control communications of ships, ground forces, and aircraft are all on those satellites. Through its sheer scale and lack of concern for collateral damage among civilians, the bombing of northern Laos may have constituted a war crime. Now, in answer to some hypothetical indictment, U.S. Air Force commanders might have argued in their defense that the communist guerrillas in northern Laos lived in and among the peasant farmers, making collateral damage an inevitability when using air power for counter-guerrilla operations. Such tactics and exculpatory logic, no matter how necessary they might seem to combatants in the heat of battle, were not sanctioned within the 1949 Geneva Conventions. But in the real world of the 1970s, there was no sovereign power, nor any international body with the authority, much less the will, to call America to account for these possible crimes. Although more moral than most states, the American state still acts like a state, maximizing its power, shirking its accountability until pressed by some higher authority within or without, whether an international tribunal or an aroused citizenry. Now, when a state fails to act morally, writers and academics, who can sometimes act as kind of the voice of civil society, can sometimes stir a nation's collective conscience, forcing the state to correct its excesses. While the war still raged, a few young American writers who were working in Laos in the villages, such as my old friend, now deceased, a man named Friend Bramfman, documented the destruction by this air war. Similarly, a group of scientists at Cornell University, led by the physicist Ralph Littauer and the astronomer Carl Sagan. I don't know if you remember Carl Sagan's documentaries. They published an analysis that concluded that the American bombing over Indochina violated the general principle, quote, that a reasonable proportionality exists between the damage caused and the military gains sought. In his introduction to this report, Neil Sheehan, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the New York Times, concluded, quote, the air war may constitute a massive war crime by the American government and its leaders. Now, through the failure of American society to examine the moral and legal meaning of this air war, the bombing of Laos and Cambodia has left a mingled, even contradictory legacy. Under the peculiar conditions of history's largest air war, the Pentagon, as I said earlier, seems to have conducted an experiment in the use of air. over camera? Though through the failure of American society to examine the moral and legal meaning of this air war, the bombing of Laos and Cambodia, as I said, has left a mingled, even contradictory legacy. Under the peculiar conditions of history's largest air war, the Pentagon seemed to have conducted an experiment in the use of air power for foreign intervention. For example, by aerial mapping of the heavily bombed Plain of Jars region in northern Laos, the Air Force developed a capability for accurate computer-controlled bombing. And in defiance of established military doctrine, which at that point said that only infantry can take or hold ground, the U.S. Air Force discovered that it could use massive tactical bombing in northern Laos and central Cambodia to hold ground without any boots on the ground, without any effective ground forces. This was a major breakthrough in military strategy. But to compensate for the absence of those ground forces, this new strategy required an aerial bombardment of unprecedented intensity, producing a level of indiscriminate destruction that defied international law on proportionality between objective sought and damage done. Now, in a parallel realpolitik analysis, the CIA compiled a, quote, a classified report. It's titled Report on the Laos Paramilitary Program at the end of that program in 1975, concluding that the secret war had been a success. And I'm going to, just a few quotes from that report to give you an idea of their assessment of this 15-year war that they just finished fighting. Although the Laos operation was in its latter years what the CIA called, quote, an outright violation of the law, the agency concluded that the secret war showed that Congress simply lacks the capacity, quote, to effectively control secret operations. In effect, the CIA gave itself a carte blanche for defiance of Congress in the future. Even though the secret war, with its Hmong militia and massive bombing, forced a full third of the Laotian population, or nearly 1 million people, to become refugees and inflicted casualties on about 20% of the Hmong tribe as, quote, what the CIA called pawns in a game about which they didn't really care, the CIA concluded, quote, the operation in Laos fulfilled its mission. Now, how could the CIA justify this human cost to reach this seemingly inhumane conclusion? Because, as the agency put it in that report, quote, U.S. combat troops never had to be deployed, and American casualties, quote, were the smallest fraction of the numbers in Vietnam. Now, please note those two key points that rendered this secret war, in the view of the CIA, a success. First, no U.S. combat troops on the ground, and second, very low American casualties. Now, significantly, this air war strategy, born of necessity in this secret war that barred the U.S. from using infantry, because Laos had been neutralized before the war started, gained an additional advantage after 1975, i.e., the minimization of casualties in a post-Vietnam era when Americans had become, and still are, casualty averse. Tested in Laos and perfected in Cambodia, this air war doctrine would become central to U.S. force projection during the next quarter century. Though such a strategy proved militarily effective, it placed the United States at variance with international law, which was moving rapidly under so-called Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention to ban all indiscriminate use of force against civilian society. And although the United States had participated in the negotiations and actually signed the draft Protocol 1 to the Geneva Protocol, it was decided under President Reagan in 1987 to reject this treaty and continue its air war tactics. Without an open public debate over the moral implications of mass tactical bombing, Laos has instead served as something of a model for subsequent U.S. foreign policy crises. Under President William Clinton, massive application of air power, divorced from any commitment of troops on the ground, would again become an instrument of U.S. foreign policy in Iraq, Bosnia, and Kosovo. In 1999, the U.S. Air Force, in the most extreme application of this strategy in the post-Vietnam period, led NATO's punitive bombing campaign against Yugoslavia's economic infrastructure as a way to force the withdrawal of Serbian troops from Kosovo. The UN's prosecutor for the Balkan War Crime Tribunal at The Hague, Ms. Carla Del Ponte, considered for a time, but then rejected filing charges against NATO and General Wesley Clark for this bombing campaign, if you will, a process, a decision-making process that aroused deep antipathy inside the Pentagon to any international oversight to its operations. Starting on October 7, 2001 in Afghanistan, the U.S. applied the same mix of tribal guerrillas and massive U.S. bombing that it had once used in Laos, sparking rising international opposition to the U.S. bombing that was only ended by the sudden collapse of the Taliban. Reviving the use of unmanned drones first developed during the Vietnam War, the Air Force deployed hundreds of Predator and Reaper drones for daily surveillance on the battlefields of Afghanistan and Pakistan, while the CIA expanded their use for assassination missile strikes across the border in Pakistan. In 2010, the UN Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killings expressed strong reservations about the legality of the use of drones for these assassinations. Between 2006 and 2012, under Presidents Bush and the first term of President Obama, CIA drones were responsible for 2,400 extrajudicial killings inside Pakistan, creating great strains in the U.S. relations with this nuclear-armed ally. After 5 years of insisting that there had not been a single collateral death from drone strikes, the Obama administration was finally forced to admit in July of last year that 473 drone attacks in Pakistan and Yemen between 2009 and 2015 had killed 116 civilians. Human rights counts were 7 times higher than that. To protect future innocent deaths, President Obama ordered that protecting bystanders should be a priority for future attacks. President Trump, as we all know, has undone that executive order just recently. In the decades since the end of the Vietnam War, there has been a widening gap between the U.S. commitment to air power and international restrictions on the bombing of civilians, a gap that has grown into a widening chasm between America and its allies. Specifically, in July 2000, delegations from 100 nations gathered at the United Nations in New York to draw up a criminal code for the new International Criminal Court, the ICC. During his last days in office in December 2000, President Clinton signed legislation for the International Criminal Court, making the U.S. a party to that body, but his conservative successor did something that, for which there is no word in English. I'll make up one: unsigning. I don't think that's actually a word. Anyway, President Bush unsigned this treaty. And then he used U.S. diplomatic power to one by one approach every nation around the globe and lean on them to grant the United States an exemption from the writ of the International Criminal Court. After over a half-century leadership, indeed, one can even say a century leadership, in the development of international relations under the rule of law, the United States under the Bush administration used its full diplomatic power to cripple the International Criminal Court. Now, in April 2002, far quicker than anyone could have imagined, the requisite 60 nations ratified the treaty. The way international treaties work is that the parties get together and they draft it, and then they set a minimal number of signatories that have to approve it through either their executive or legislative processes. And once that number hits, the treaty becomes active for those nations that have signed it. So, in April 2002, the International Criminal Court Treaty hit that requisite number. It came into being, and on July 1st, the new International Criminal Court, actually, the justices took their seats at The Hague. And then in May 2002, President Bush's administration, as I said, unsigned the treaty. And in June 2002, the Bush administration advised the UN Security Council that no Americans would serve as UN peacekeepers, and it would consider cutting funds for UN peacekeeping operations unless it were exempted from the ICC, a demand that provoked some unease among our European allies. And then over the next few years, the Bush administration got that succession of exemptions. So in the 30 years since the United States bombed civilian villages in Laos and discovered this new warfighting doctrine, Washington has become wedded to a strategy of air warfare that violates the 1949 Geneva Convention and its later protocols, weakening its leadership in the campaign for the international rule of law. I want to turn to another aspect of the secret war in Laos, the U.S. alliance with tribal militia in Laos, and particularly look at the relationship between that tribal militia and the illicit drug traffic. Throughout the Cold War, the CIA used gangsters and warlords, many of them drug dealers, to fight communism. In one of history's accidents, the Iron Curtain fell along an Asian opium zone that stretched for 5,000 miles from Turkey to Thailand. In Burma in the 1950s, Laos in the 1970s, and Afghanistan in the 1980s, the CIA allied with Highland warriors to mobilize tribal armies against the Soviet Union and Communist China. These leaders generally exploited the CIA alliance to become drug lords, expanding their opium production and exporting refined heroin. The agency tolerated such trafficking and, when necessary, blocked investigations. Since ruthless drug lords made effective anti-communist allies and heroin profits amplified their power, CIA agents, operating oftentimes alone, half a world away from home, did not tamper with the requisites of success in such delicate covert operations. Let's turn first to the Laos operation, this other dimension of that air war that I was talking about. Now, in Asia, distance insulated the CIA from the consequences. It's one of you. It's one of you. They're holding up. In Laos in the 1960s, the CIA battled communists with a secret army of 30,000 Hmong guerrillas. Tough Highlanders' only cash crop was opium. Now, a handful of CIA agents relied upon tribal leaders to motivate their troops and Lao generals to protect their cover. And when Hmong officers loaded opium on the CIA's Air America, and the Lao Army's commander opened the largest heroin laboratory in the world, the CIA was silent. In its secret 1972 report on the traffic, the CIA Inspector General explained the agency's complex relations with its local Laotian allies. Quote,
Does anybody in here have a silver camera? Oh, you can hear it. We weren't sure you could. I'm sorry.
That's okay, man.
Thank you.
Anyway, the CIA Inspector General's report in 1972 on these allies said, quote, the past involvement of many of these officers in drugs is well known, yet their goodwill considerably facilitates the military activities of agency-supported irregulars. By 1971, according to a White House survey, 34% of all U.S. soldiers in South Vietnam were heroin addicts, all supplied from these laboratories operated by CIA assets in Laos. When I went to Laos to investigate in 1971, the Lao Army commander, General Uwan Radakone, graciously opened his opium accounts for my perusal, allowing me to take notes. But when I asked the U.S. Embassy, was General Uwan now or ever been involved in drugs, they said absolutely not, no information of that nature. In a Hmong village where we were investigating the opium shipments on Air America, CIA mercenaries ambushed my research team. A CIA operative threatened to murder my Lao interpreter unless I quit my research. When my book was in press, the CIA's head of covert action, Mr. Cordmeyer Jr., pressured my publisher to suppress it, and the CIA's general counsel demanded deletions. After the book was published unaltered, CIA agents in Laos pressed my sources to recant and convinced the House Foreign Relations Committee that my allegations were baseless. Simultaneously, the CIA's Inspector General conducted that investigation that I quoted just a minute ago and confirmed basically my allegations. In defense of the CIA's inaction on drugs, its own Inspector General said in that 1972 report, and I quote, the war has clearly been our overriding priority in Southeast Asia, and all other issues have taken second place. It would be foolish to deny this, and we see no reason to do so. By 1974, Southeast Asian syndicates were supplying about a quarter of the U.S. domestic demand with heroin from the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia. But Asia was too remote for allegations of CIA complicity to pack any political punch. In its critical review of CIA operations in the 1970s, the U.S. Senate's famous Church Committee criticized agency alliances with drug lords, but forfeited the chance to censure and correct, a failure whose costs would become clear during the CIA's covert war in Afghanistan just a few years later, from 1979 to 1992. Let's now turn to that Afghan operation. Now, as we all know, in 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and the Sandinista left-wing guerrillas seized Managua, Nicaragua, prompting two CIA operations with revealing similarities. During the 1980s, the CIA, working through Pakistani intelligence, spent about $2 to $3 billion to support the Afghan resistance. At the start of the covert war in 1979, Afghanistan harvested about 100 tons of raw opium annually. This opium was sold in regional markets, mainly in Iran, which had a ferocious opium smoking habit, and there was no regional heroin production. Within 2 years, the situation had changed dramatically. The Pakistan-Afghanistan borderlands had become the world's top heroin producer, supplying, by 1985, a full 60% of U.S. demand. In Pakistan, according to official government statistics, addicts went from 0 in 1979 to 1,200,000 by 1985, the highest level of addiction on the planet. Again, CIA assets controlled the heroin trade. As the Mujahideen, the Islamic guerrillas, seized territory inside Afghanistan, they ordered peasants to make their payments, their tax payments, in opium. Across the border, Afghan leaders and local dealers operated heroin laboratories under the protection of Pakistani intelligence. In May of 1990, as the operation was winding down, the Washington Post published a front-page article reporting that a man named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the CIA's favorite asset who had received over $1 billion in U.S. aid, was also the leading heroin trafficker among the Afghan guerrillas. In 1995, the former CIA director of this Afghan operation, a man named Charles Cogan, admitted sacrificing the drug war to fight the Cold War. And if you listen to a quote that he gave to an Australian television interview, you'll hear the exact same logic that we heard in that Inspector General's report about the Vietnam drug traffic. Quote from Mr. Cogan, "Our main mission was to do as much damage as possible to the Soviets. We didn't really have the resources or the time to devote to an investigation of the drug trade. I don't think we need to apologize for this. Every situation has its fallout. There was fallout in terms of drugs, yes, but the main objective was accomplished. The Soviets left Afghanistan," end quote. Again, distance insulated the CIA from the political fallout of its alliance with drug lords. Now, once that heroin left Pakistan, there was a problem. These Pakistani dealers were not professional criminals. They were not connected or protected or plugged in. So how to get it to market? Well, somehow, some way, they did a deal with the Sicilian Mafia. And the Sicilian Mafia picked a bunch of nice middle-aged mom and pops and sent them to the United States to open up pizza parlors from Boston, Massachusetts, all the way to Milton, Wisconsin. If you're going down 39 to 90 on your left as you're about to cross the Illinois border, you'll see the exit for Milton, okay? That's where one of these mom and pop pizza parlors was. And in the condiments from Sicily was Pakistani heroin. And there was a famous pizza parlor connection case in which the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration wrapped them all up and put them on trial, okay? So American journalists and academics ignored the cost of this covert war and did little enlighten the public. Basically, the political calculus was just a bit too complicated for the American public. You know, secret war in Afghanistan, Pakistani trafficking, Sicilian Mafia, mom and pop pizza parlor. There was just too many connections, you know. So, now, when the U.S. intervened in Afghanistan again in October 2001, at the start of the global war on terror, the CIA shipped in $70 million in greenbacks lashed to pallets to mobilize its old coalition of tribal warlords to topple the Taliban regime. Now, after Kabul, the capital of the country, was captured, these same warlords filled a political vacuum in the countryside and presided over a proliferation of opium planting. And it was the most amazing increase. Afghanistan's opium production rose from 186 tons in 2001 to 8,400 tons by 2007. It was a phenomenal increase. By 2008, Afghan opium provided over 90% of the world's heroin supply. And here's an amazing statistic. According to World Bank estimates, it supplied over 50% of Afghanistan's gross domestic product. Okay? Now, we all know about the Colombian cartels and the outrageous Pablo Escobar and all that. Well, at the peak of that cocaine cartel boom, they only accounted for 3% of Colombia's gross domestic product. This was something that had never happened in the history of modern economies. In 2017, our current U.S. commander for the Allies in Afghanistan, General John Nicholson, estimated that 60% of the Taliban, that's 60% of the funds that financed the Taliban, came from heroin, allowing the guerrillas to recruit a new crop of teenage fighters for the fighting season every spring, and likely extending the pacification effort, already 15 years long, into the foreseeable future. As long as there are teenage boys and spring comes to the mountains of Afghanistan and the human brain has natural opium receptors, the Taliban can fight forever. Let's turn now to the next of those CIA operations. In Central America, however, simple proximity made the political fallout from the CIA's operations explosive. Remember, 1979, the Soviets march in and grab Kabul, and the Sandinista guerrillas fight their way into Managua and take Nicaragua and send the Somoza regime into exile in South Florida. So the CIA mounted an operation in Central America during the 1980s, the Contra operation, to harass and overthrow the Sandinista government. In August of 1996, a newspaper in Silicon Valley called the San Jose Mercury News published an explosive expose that tried to go to the next step in this investigation of drugs and establish a direct link between CIA operations and the distribution of drugs right here in the U.S. Now, in this story, which was the most famous and many thought the most important news story of 1996, titled Dark Alliance, the San Jose Mercury News reported that a syndicate allied with Nicaragua's CIA-backed Contra guerrillas had delivered tons of cut-price cocaine to Los Angeles street gangs, the Crips and the Bloods, during the 1980s, that had launched the national crack cocaine epidemic. Needless to say, this story sparked a national media controversy and outrage among African Americans. Now, the San Jose Mercury News was not only cited in Silicon Valley, but they had one of the first newspapers to actually have a story-based website, okay? So, like something that's very common now, you've got the hard copy of the paper, and then you have the digital edition, and you have all these cool graphics on the digital edition, right? The San Jose Mercury News had one of the very first to have a cool graphic. And their graphic was maybe a bit too cool for many people's taste. There was the official seal of the CIA. In front of that was a man smoking crack from a crack pipe. Okay? That was the story's logo. Very catchy. And within weeks, the number of hits at the Mercury's website hit an amazing 800,000 daily. I mean, that's probably what? I mean, that's nothing today. That's inconsequential. But back then, that was amazing. 800,000 hits at a website that's phenomenal, off the charts. And more importantly, those downloads were taking place in African American communities across the United States. And the anger was rising in places like South Central Los Angeles. In November of 1996, the Congressional Black Caucus, which is the African American caucus inside the U.S. Congress, demanded an investigation. And the head of that Congress, Representative Maxine Waters, charged the CIA may have been responsible for the crack epidemic that had ravaged South Central Los Angeles. Now, to quiet this controversy among a key Democratic Party constituency, in November 1996, President Clinton told his aide, Rahm Emanuel, to do something, and Rahm Emanuel hit the CIA director, John Deutsch, virtually by the collar and shoved him on a flight and sent him to South Central Los Angeles, where he stood up in front of a community meeting in a room kind of like this, but had 800 people in it, of very, very angry African Americans. And you can actually find that on YouTube. It's the only time that the CIA director has ever appeared at a community meeting to discuss the fallout, if you will, from any CIA policy. Now, Director Deutsch absolutely denied the CIA had been involved in knowingly or in any way, and was in any way complicit with the trafficking of this cocaine through Central America and the United States. But he offered a concession. He said, I will investigate. So he ordered his Inspector General, the CIA has an Inspector General, and Inspector General Frederick Hitz, in early 1998, as a consequence of that Deutsch visit to Los Angeles, released Volume 1 of its Inspector General's report, and that report claimed that no CIA agents were personally involved in the traffic, something, by the way, that the original series in the San Jose Mercury News had not argued. Okay, this was all being done by the CIA assets, not the CIA. But nonetheless, That's what the report said. The American media, the national press, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post said, they reported these findings. They said, case closed. CIA was completely exonerated. Okay? But in October of 1998, okay, after all the furor died down, the CIA Inspector General released Volume 2 of the report. The first one was called The California Stories. That was the domestic one, which is the most controversial. But this was the next one was about what had been going on in Central America, my sort of terrain, the overseas alliance between the CIA and the traffickers. And this is an absolutely extraordinary report. It detailed a very close alliance between the CIA and arguably the man who was the biggest cocaine smuggler in the Caribbean, a man named Alan Hyde, who was the godfather of the Bay Islands off the coast of Honduras. And starting on paragraph 913, which, by the way, you can't find, because if you go to the CIA's website, paragraphs 913 to 960 have been removed. It says it right there. But you can actually dig around on the net, and you can find it. And if you find it, you'll find 40 of the most extraordinary paragraphs that ever come out of the CIA, which explain that the agency had protected Hyde from all criminal investigations, knowing that he was a major trafficker. DEA, Coast Guard, and CIA itself. This guy's had 35 ships on the high seas carrying cocaine from Colombia to the United States. And for 5 years, from 1986, actually 6 years, from 1986 to 1992, the peak of the crack cocaine epidemic, Alan Hyde was completely protected from any kind of investigation. Now, the CIA, as that report reveals, was fully aware that Hyde was operating 35 ships to smuggle cocaine from Colombia into the United States, but still approved the alliance at the highest level, all the way to director of CIA. And although the CIA Inspector General posted this full report with extended quotations in paragraphs 913 to 960 from agents and from official correspondence and memoranda, this I found amazing. The national press, and I've looked, but I can't find it, the national press didn't report this, okay, because it wasn't in the executive summary. That's, by the way, if you ever want to understand find your way around a Washington report, the politics are in the executive summary. The information is in the back pages. But I'm an historian, and I did what historians do. We're pretty boring people. We sit down and we just start reading, and we get to the end, and then we find out that we just keep doing this all day. And there in paragraph 913, I found out this is amazing. This is stunning. This is, wow. You know, in Laos, I guessed that this might be going on, but here's the agency saying this in memoranda and quotes from the director of the CIA. It's all right here. You know, a close working alliance. This is amazing. So I put it in my book, the revised edition of Politics of Heroin. And the best of my knowledge, I'm the only person that's ever cited it. Don't know why. But there you go. The agency's realpolitik alliance with drug lords may or may not have increased the flow of narcotics into the United States. But these alliances nonetheless left a deep reservoir of suspicion among African Americans that deepened this country's racial divide. Well, so let me reflect very quickly to conclude. Now, nearly a half-century after the U.S. combat forces left Vietnam, the legacy of that war continues to cast a long shadow across America. As winner of the Cold War and leader of a new democratic world order, the United States chose not to examine its systematic violations of laws, covenants, and treaties during the Vietnam War, leaving a number of moral and legal issues unresolved. Yet as the U.S. military stumbled towards defeat in Indochina, it also developed new technologies that would, during the decade of the global war on terror, contribute to a transformation in warfare, leading to a new form of robotic warfare based in satellites and computers. At a deeper level, those information failures proved self-correcting, leading to experiments that result in major advances in military technology. Under the pressure of that protracted war in Vietnam, the Pentagon worked to improve individual components, satellite communications, remote sensing, computer-triggered bombing, aerial gunships, and unmanned aircraft that would emerge 40 years later into a new system of robotic warfare. Within the longer arc of technological progress, Igloo White proved transformative, integrating electronic sensors in lieu of human intelligence and computerized targeting in lieu of visual contact, moving warfare towards some future electronic battlefield. So let me argue that although the Vietnam War ended 40 years ago, its legacy and all its ambiguity has lived on to shape our present and arguably our future. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, we can take questions.
Is there any good way to fight a war? I mean, it seems like the more complicated it gets, the more we want to keep the bright-eyed boys we love off the front lines, and so then we get drug dealers to fight or electronics to fight, but it doesn't make it any better. Is that your...
Well, I mean, I'm just trying to analyze.
No, I agree, but I mean, is there anything that you would advise as a better way to fight a war? Is there just no good way to
Let me address, my dad always said, my dad was a West Point graduate, and he fought in 2 wars. He fought in World War II, he's an artillery officer, and he fought in Korea. And he argued that World War II was, from a soldier's perspective, was a pretty good war. And I said, what's your stand? He said, because the nature of the casualties that were inflicted upon the soldiers and the field medical hospitals were pretty balanced. So if you got wounded, you had a reasonable shot of surviving. And as wars went, he said, World War II, was a better war, because in past wars, most soldiers died of disease or infections from wounds that couldn't be treated. So, I mean, that was his sense. It was, from a soldier's perspective, World War II was a better war. And if we're trying to sort of calibrate good wars and bad wars, let me make a judgment about Vietnam. Vietnam was an extraordinary war, okay, because the United States, first of all, was fighting in an asymmetric terrain. We had a vast mechanized armada that we applied to what was essentially an impoverished Southeast Asian society of bamboo huts and villages, okay? So the kind of balance of terror that's often struck by equal nations that fight wasn't there. Moreover, as we began losing, we did everything we could to avoid that. We used every ounce of our military capacity in Vietnam. This idea that we somehow didn't fight as hard as we could have in Vietnam is one of the most, I think, unfortunate myths about that war. We did everything. I mean, the bombing, the air campaign was enormous. We mobilized at various times half the B-52s we had in the world. We stripped bases from around the world to mass these huge armadas of these great behemoths, and we rained down boxes that were 2 miles long and a half-mile wide that incinerated everything within them. I mean, it was fighter bombers were bombing in phenomenal levels. The level of bombardment in Laos was not only intense, but we designed special bombs, anti-personnel weapons called bommies. We had canisters that looked like 500-pound bombs that opened up and would release these little bommies that would shoot out wires that were designed to blow off the heel of a soldier, because if you killed one, he's just dead. But if you blow off a heel, you're going to also immobilize 4 of the soldiers who have to carry it. All right, that sort of thing. I mean, somebody was thinking about this, like, oh, let's blow off the, I mean, somebody somewhere was doing that, okay? And the Laos is covered with millions of them. When President Obama went to Laos in his last year in office, he talked about how we sent, we turned the valleys of Laos into killing grounds. And he pledged $90 million to continue the cleanup of the unexploded bombs. The Phoenix program, I didn't get into the Phoenix program. Phoenix program was a massive program launched by the CIA in collaboration with the Vietnamese National Police that built about 42 provincial interrogation centers, each one of which had a provincial reconnaissance unit made up of cutthroats, rapists, killers, each one of which were branded in their upper arm to stop them from running away with the words in Vietnamese, Sat Cong, kills commies, okay? Right here, in a tropical climate, right there where it can be seen, okay? So, and those guys were responsible. The CIA Director William Colby, in testimony before Congress, said that the Phoenix program killed 20,000, was responsible for 20,000 extrajudicial killings. If you add the South Vietnamese killings done, which were part of the same program, there were 41,000 extrajudicial killings in South Vietnam done by the Phoenix program, and countless tens of thousands of tortures preceding those killings. So there was nothing that we could do, everything from devastating the landscape with this massive air armada to using the most sophisticated psychological and physical torture techniques to penetrate deep inside the minds of the Vietnamese to break them. And it all failed. So I would argue that Vietnam, that's why it looms in this society, and why we talk about it, and why there's this sanitized documentary that's trying to make us all now feel really good about Vietnam, on PBS. Is that it's this very dark experience, okay, in America. It's the worst war that we've ever fought. That's what I argue. If you want to calibrate, it's the worst war, because we did everything. We threw aside the moral code. And by the way, a lot of people like to, particularly during the Bush-Cheney era, there was all this sort of, nudge, nudge, tough guy celebratory stuff about, what we did with Phoenix program. We really showed them who, how, and what's what. The intelligence officers who worked in Phoenix and have written about it argue that, as one of them put, never in the entire history of the Phoenix program did we ever capture a single high-ranking Viet Cong. You mean to say that we killed 41,000 people, we tortured tens of thousands, and we never got one of their people? And it's this formidable hubris in the United States that there's never been any examination of what may have happened in Phoenix. Let me tell you a story, okay? I went to high school with a guy 2 years ahead of me, John Merson. John Merson wrote a book published by Random House, and he sent me the book in manuscript to comment, because I taught about Vietnam. So I read the book, and he describes how he's a Marine Corps Lance Corporal, and he's up in I Corps, and he gets intelligence that says at a certain time there's going to be some sampans coming down a river loaded with Viet Cong. So his unit, he sets them up, and those sampans come down the river. He opens up, he's described this in the book, and he kills everybody. Okay, and then they turn the lights on, and it's all women and children. Okay, and so what did he do? He just took his unit, and they went to a hill, they dug in, and they sat out the war. So my stepfather, Colonel Cougar Bright, now deceased, U.S. Marine Corps, was a former deputy chief of intelligence under General Westmoreland in Saigon. That was his last assignment before his retirement. So he was deputy, the #2 intelligence guy. So I told Kruger the story over Christmas break, and without missing a beat, he said to me, "Good counterintelligence by the enemy." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, think about it. He said it like, faster than I could have said that. He just zapped it right back at me. He said, think about it. They set up the Marine unit. They give them bad intelligence. The Marines go kill those women and children. They're completely demoralized. Back in the villages, all their relatives, those huge kinship networks, have had their relatives killed by the American imperialists. So whatever that village's loyalties were before that event, they're now bitterly un-American, and they will fight America till kingdom comes. So it's win-win for the enemy. And then you go one step further. Okay, and this is something that there's 30,000 books on the Vietnam War in Memorial Library at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I teach. Not one of them will admit the possibility of that the entire Phoenix program. Look, what does counterintelligence always do? What does counterintelligence do when it's got an enemy operative? What does it do? It flips them. What did the double-cross system, British intelligence, do during World War II? They knew all who the German spies were. Did they pick them up and shoot them? No. They let them operate. They fed them bad information. They flipped the German intelligence network and made it an extension of British intelligence. So, the communists have a ruthless and very effective police state from the time the Communist Party was founded in the late 1920s in order to protect themselves from infiltration by French Sûreté, French secret police. They inbuilt in their party structure counterintelligence right from the beginning. They have brilliant counterintelligence. They're a ruthless police state. The one thing they're really good at in Vietnam is policing. So what did they do when we set down the Phoenix program? feed them the blood of innocence. Give them the neutralists and the anti-communists, right? Feed the killing machine. It's that kind of thing. American society has never even begun to contemplate that we perpetuated this monstrosity in Vietnam, okay, and it was counterproductive. The arrogance that we still have over that war, the unexamined nature of that war, we just won't think about what that war really did to us and what we sacrificed to fight it and why and how we failed. So that's why I say the Vietnam War was, apologies, Ken Burns, nice try. It was an ugly, ugly war.
Another question over here.
Sorry, I go on too long.
Did I understand you to say a little while ago that the PBS presentation on Vietnam was the sanitized version?
From what I've seen I've read all the reviews. I've only watched the
Did you see the program?
No, I haven't watched all of that. But
It was far from sanitized. It exposed things that I believe the general public had no idea of how much BS went on behind the scenes.
I'm talking about the actual conduct of the war. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I'll go ahead. While you're doing that, is there any oversight of the CIA today that would be, in your estimation, more effective than it was back in, say, the 60s and 70s?
It appears that if you look at the record, and again, somebody else might have a different interpretation, but the standing intelligence committees wind up being in a kind of a collaborative relationship with the CIA, much like the FISA courts that are supposedly meant to oversight the National Security Agency. This is a formal apparatus that when the National Security Agency does any kind of wiretapping or surveillance, they're supposed to go to the FISA courts. Okay, it's believed that the approval rate of the FISA courts, which are made up of federal judges who are specially assigned to this duty, is approximately 100%. Okay, all right. So the Congressional and Senate Intelligence Oversight Committees generally function that way until they take on a special investigation. And there have been two that have been, well, the two major investigations were the Church Committee, Church Committee investigation into CIA assassinations and that reported in like 1975-76. And the other one was the special investigation conducted under Chair Dianne Feinstein that issued the report in 2014. It's about the 550-page executive summary on CIA torture and interrogation. And it's the 6,000 or 7,000 page report has never been released and probably never will be released. And it's what the politics of that conflict between the CIA and the investigative unit inside the Senate Intelligence Committee was a very interesting spectacle because it's so extraordinary. So when Congress actually does its role in a special investigation rather than a routine investigation, that's when you get genuine oversight. And that report is actually very much worth reading. Okay, it establishes a couple of things. One, that the CIA was guilty of torture. Two, that the CIA basically misrepresented the yield from torture to the American people. All right. And three, that the CIA's torture did not lead to Osama bin Laden, despite what the film Zero Dark 30 purported to portray. Okay, so that's an interesting report.
Yeah, I'd like you to keep talking. What did the Vietnam War do to us? 40 years later.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a vast cultural divide at the time. It split the 1950s Cold War consensus right down the middle. It ended that consensus. And it split American society I think that created a permanent political divide that exists today. People complain about the divided politics, the intense rhetoric, the lack of amity, the complete division. I think that breach occurred during Vietnam, and it's widened ever since. I mean, you know, both Hillary Clinton, I mean, we're still living it out. Both Hillary Clinton was a very strong anti-war sentiment. She wasn't in the movement that way, but she was in one of those movements. She was in the women's movement and in African-American civil rights movements, very heavily dedicated back in the 60s. Donald Trump, of course, was the exact opposite. Okay, so, you know, that bitter division that we saw in the last election, it was, you know, also evident very much in the 2004 election between Senator Kerry and Bush. Again, you know, in that election in 2004, you know, which occurred, what was that, 40 years after the Vietnam War was over? I got that right? 20 years? No, 30 years after the Vietnam War was over. At that point in America, you may remember 2004 is when the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices in Iraq, were blowing. U.S. troops were taking horrific casualties. That war was going extremely bad. That was before the 2007 surge. That war was plunging downward, okay, to a nadir. And what was the war we debated in American political life in the 2004 election? There was barely a word said about the Iraq War. What we debated was George Bush's, you know, Air Force Reserve record and John Kerry's swift boat record. Okay, so that you know, in the most profound level, the Vietnam War introduced this deep cultural division in American society, and produced almost two cultures that have increasingly lost the ability to talk to each other. And that, I mean, that you could argue that's a bold statement. It's a broad statement. Somebody could contest. I mean, we had three academics in the room. They each take three different positions on it, I'm sure. That's what we're good at.
Interesting evening. My head is full of information. Let us thank Dr. McCoy for our program.